going to war is not good for you. Anyone who thinks it is kind of a bit nuts.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
The single greatest sacrifice I've made is my family.
We weren't out there to take country. We were out there to do something. That was our job.
I did feel a lot of regret.
Friends were still getting killed.
It got to the point where, you're going to funerals quite often.
Do I lead under fire?
And that was a heavy responsibility, I guess, on my shoulders that I didn't want to screw up.
War itself is horrific. It's a horror story. It should never be dressed up as if it's something glorious.
Not what you can do for yourself, but what can you do for your country.
The volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Mark Mathieson was a psychologist in the Australian Army, including time as the SAS regimental psychologist. He deployed to Timor and 6 times to Afghanistan. This is our conversation about the psychology of Special Forces soldiers and the impact of war. I'm Alex Lloyd, speaking over Zoom today with Mark Mathieson. Mark, welcome to Life on the Line.
Thanks for having me.
Mark, tell me a bit about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
So I was born in Melbourne, in Queen Victoria Hospital, which is no longer there. My parents, well, actually, my dad was posted to work on what was then a State Rivers and Water Supply Commission hydroelectric dam in northeastern Victoria. So he was a civil engineer, and he'd been sent up to help design and construct the spillway of that dam. So As a very young boy, I spent about the first 6 years of my life up in the mountains of the northeast, so up around Mount Wills and Omeo and those sorts of areas, pretty much running a fairly wild life in the bush and in those, what were those, in those days, quite wild rivers as well. They're all quite tamed now. But so I grew up in that country area. Dad, the dam kind of finished construction or was finishing construction, and so they were redeploying most of the engineers. And my dad got a job in head office for State Rivers and Water Supply Commission, which in those days was in Toorak. So we moved back down to the Mornington Peninsula, to Frankston actually, which is where my mum's family is from. And I pretty much spent the rest of my childhood and teenage years growing up in and around Frankston and Mount Eliza.
And do you have any military history in the family, Mark?
Yeah, look, a little bit. My grandfather, so my dad's dad, he served. Unfortunately, he died quite young, so he had a massive heart attack. Would have been about 1949, I think. So my dad was only 4. So he served for a number of years. I don't believe he actually deployed overseas. So he was served with 9th Motor Regiment, which for whatever reason, I don't know much about it. But so he served for a little bit. He may have gone over, but it would have been only a very small part of that. On my mother's side, my grandfather, he had a bit more of an extensive military service history. So he served with the 2nd 25th. I think he went all the way across to Egypt and then came pretty much straight back, and then served in Tarakan, where he ended up getting blown up with with some shrapnel in him by a Japanese hand grenade, and was medevaced back to Australia. But he had a much longer, I guess, association with the military, not least of which because he lived a bit longer. But he was definitely involved in veterans issues, for many years. So I remember him certainly being somebody who had some influence over me. My dad was of an age to be conscripted to Vietnam, but wasn't, and he missed out on the ballot. But yeah, both grandfathers were involved, and that was sort of at the periphery of life. It was something that was, came up at Christmases and, family get-togethers, but it wasn't a predominant piece. So not a strong military tradition in the family, but it was there in the background.
So if it's just something there in the background, I guess what first piques your own interest in the military? Is it just history interest? Is it Anzac Day traditions, or is it more a professional pursuit for you?
Look, I think it was a personal interest. I was an athlete as a young guy, so PE was always my favourite subject. Ran cross country and swam for the school. So I was always interested in performing, as in physically pushing my limits. Got into triathlon, a bit like Dan Pronk, funnily enough. It was the time in the 80s where triathlon was sort of at its zenith, and I was like everybody else, so on that bandwagon, was doing quite well, testing my limits, seeing what I could do. And I guess I was just fascinated by how humans could push their limits and perform at their best. And as part of that, I guess I was kind of fell into thinking about the military as another opportunity to test myself physically and I guess psychologically. And those infamous Army Reserve ads with the 1318 overture sort of garnered my interest at a time when I was, at uni studying undergraduate psychology, bored off my head academically because it was all sort of very basic psychology. My passion was sports psychology, and that was sort of more of a postgraduate area of interest. And I thought, well, maybe the Army Reserve is something that I could do where I could physically test myself, learn some new skills, and perhaps ultimately put some of that psychology stuff to practice as well. So I joined the reserves as a soldier and did the good old 6 weeks basic training, common induction training, I think it was called in those days. I was quite a bit older at that stage. I was 27 and was still finishing off my postgraduate psychology and getting life underway, I suppose, professionally. So it was a personal challenge to see if I could do something different.
Why, out of interest, soldier and not an officer? If you sound like someone who'd go down that more traditional officer route.
Yeah, I guess because I was drawn to the physical challenge primarily, having that sporting background. I knew that I could transfer across into the officer's stream as a psychologist once I'd finished my postgraduate studies. So I thought, well, there's nothing to be lost here by joining as a soldier, getting that kind of rubber stamp on your forehead to say you've done basic training, you've got some basic soldier skills under the belt. And look, if I really enjoyed that, I probably would have stayed. I actually did apply initially and sort of express interest in reserve commando. So the 2 commando company in Williamstown in Melbourne were direct recruiting in those days. So you could join as a direct recruit soldier and go through commando training. And so I thought that would be the bee's knees. I could certainly test myself physically and also, perhaps be able to perform as a psychologist in an elite capacity. Unfortunately, I've got poor vision in one eye. So I was med class 4 at recruiting for commando. They said, no, you're not going to meet the medical standards. And funny story, I sort of, kind of gave up on my military career at that stage after being told I was med class 4. They rang me 12 months later. So Defence Recruiting rang me a year later and said, we're wondering if you're interested in continuing your application. We noticed that you haven't actually closed it off. And I said, well, you guys sent me a letter saying I was med class 4. So I thought that was the end of the process. And they said, okay, no, we didn't note that. We'll close off your file and that'll be the end of it. And I just sort of said, well, look, out of interest, are there different medical standards for different jobs? Because I'm also, nearly a qualified psychologist. And I went, yeah, you can get a medical waiver for certain things if you've got critical skills. So you could definitely probably join join psychology corps because that's something that we need as a critical skill. So 3 months later, I basically joined as a soldier, but my destiny at that stage was to go into Army psychology because that's the skill set they wanted. And so after initial training, I went off to do Australian Army Psychology Corps, ECN 131 examiner training, which I found, no offense against any examiners out there that are listening, I found incredibly boring. So I spent 2.5 years as an examiner, doing a lot of psych examiner work, finishing off my master's, and then transferred across into the officer stream at the first opportunity. My goal, interestingly, at that stage was to get back into Special Forces. So I spent the next 7 years working my ring off and ended up being posted back into then 1 Commando Regiment in about 7 years or 6 years after that.
It is funny you mentioned Dr. Dan Pronk earlier and what it is about ex-triathletes end up with Special Forces aspirations via some sort of medical route. You joined in the late 90s. You've covered off your first few years there in the military. Before we get to 1st Commando Regiment, though, like I said, you joined in the late 90s. The main sort of action that was kicking around for us then, we'd done some peacekeeping work. Timor was a larger thing. But then this world-changing event happens September 11, 2001, and we're coming up on as we record, coming up on the 20-year anniversary of that. What's your memory of 9/11?
Well, look, I think like a lot of military personnel, I mean, it was very apparent very quickly within defence that, you know, there was a lot of change coming, and it was coming extremely quickly. And I think, again, like a lot of other military personnel, I mean, I watched with a degree of fascination and perhaps even a degree of terror, you know, the lead up to the deployment into Timor, a lot of the logistic issues that, you know, caused great stress for the army, and the rapid acquisition of a whole lot of products. And also, within psychology corps, you know, there was a rapid realization that this time around, really from 1999 onwards, you know, we were going to be deploying, and we were going to be deploying on every rotation. And the reality of what a lot of us had joined up to do was really starting to sink in. So, I set a goal probably fairly shortly after 9/11 of saying, well, look, I need to now really get serious about thinking about whether I want to deploy, because there's only going to be limited opportunities if Timor, you know, was only going to last at that stage for a period of time. We knew there was people starting to go to the Middle East as well, but that was sort of seen as a far-flung dream for a reserve psychologist. But look, things changed very rapidly, and it became very apparent right across defence that, you know, you either got serious or you really were just in the way. My goal certainly was to get serious, and I was certainly fortunate enough to get a few gigs across to East Timor as a newly minted captain in the reserve. And that was, I guess, the first indication that certainly psychology corps was pretty light on. You know, we had only a small number of officers in the regular army, and they were on high rotation already, you know, from sort of 2001 onwards. They were also, you know, they were staffing the rotations into the Middle East. They were staffing the rotations that were going through Timor. And when you've only got 30 or 40 officers in your entire corps, and of those, probably only 10 or 20 are deployable at any one point in time for a variety of critical posting reasons, suddenly, you know, things get busy.
I'm sure. And you mentioned your Timor deployment then. I don't want to overlook that. I suppose it sets sort of a foundation benchmark or a measurement point where you get to measure what is so different about the special forces work you end up doing. What is your role in Timor? You're obviously deploying as a psychological examiner and psych support. What's the kind of that day-to-day for you in a deployment context?
Yeah, so that was I first deployed to Timor in 2003. So the operation itself was in a sort of a maintenance phase. You know, most of the ARA psychology personnel had already been there and done that, and they were then now starting to staff the Middle East rotations. And so I was sort of seen in many ways as a bit of a litmus test. We still had a embedded psych support team, and a psych support team is really only two personnel. So a psychological examiner, a soldier, and an officer, so a psychologist. So I was the psychologist at that stage. I'd finished my master's and was now across on the dark side as a psychology officer, just promoted to captain. And I had a psychological examiner, or a sergeant, who was the other part of the team. So I went across in late 2003, and we did what's called a force insertion extraction team. So we were a team of logisticians, doctors, psychologists, other loggies that were pulling the rotation out. So they're doing a rip out. And we had to do with most of their psych screens. So everyone at that stage, it had been mandated by Army that everyone had a psych screen before they left country. So we were pushed down to a little place called Port Hira, and basically we saw everyone who'd just come out of theatre, and then they jumped on, you know, the little planes in those days back to Darwin and went home. So that was my first trip, only a very short one, about 6 weeks, and then basically I was being evaluated, I guess, by head of corps and by Army Psychology Corps. You know, could I operate effectively in that space as a reservist? Got the tick in the box, I'm assuming. And then in early 2004, they asked me to be the embedded team. So that was a 4-month gig. You're embedded basically with the formation at the headquarters level, so Australian National Command Element, ASNCE it was called in those days. And you're the team that supports the entire contingent. And from that perspective, which is a slightly different perspective, you're effectively one of the commander's strategic HR managers. So any personnel issues that are going on in theatre, whether it be, soldiers struggling with marital stuff back home, and there's a, case about whether we compassionately return them to Australia, or through to, people's careers continue in theatre. So you have people that are applying for, subsequent postings. It might be a remote locality posting when they get back to Australia. There's a requirement to have a psychological evaluation before they can have that posting struck. So you'd have people changing trades. You'd have people that are applying for pilot training, or, so people's careers continued. And we very much didn't want them to feel penalised by going on an operation. And so that meant having this sort of capability in theatre where they could go and get their medical evaluations done for these things that were going to happen back in Australia later in their career, and also getting the psych evaluation done for those things as well as all the, putting out the small spot fires where people were having difficulties on the deployment or difficulties back home. They might need a little bit of, supportive counselling. They might need an assessment report written to provide some evidence for the commander about how best to manage those people. So, my brief when I flew into Timor on that job, the XO at that stage was a RAFI in the Australian National Command Element. He knew absolutely nothing about psychologists because RAF had very few psychologists at that stage. His brief to me at the beginning of my 4 months trip was, I think you've got a troopie outside. That's your car. I'm pretty sure you know where your room is. I'm assuming you know what to do with your job. I'll see you in 4 months. And that was it. So pretty much we made it up as we went based on what the previous rotation of psychologists had done. But we had huge freedom of movement. We had a vehicle. We could go wherever we wanted in the theatre. We just basically went where the work was. So if something happened or there was a critical incident and we needed to work with some of the soldiers to debrief them, then we'd jump on a UN helo and fly to that location. We made regular trips down to Westbat, which was the front line, if you want to call it that, down on the sort of the border between Indonesia and West Timor and East Timor, and provided services in that location. We pretty much went around wherever we wanted to go in the theatre to make sure that we got the job done, because there was only the two of us.
And it's 5 or 6 years you've been in the military, you finally get these deployments. So you join as a reservist and then you're getting that sort of full-time operational experience. I can imagine, and also, again, in the first couple of years after September 11, I can only imagine that's making you hungrier for that sort of special forces interest and Middle East deployments. And then, as we covered briefly earlier, in 2005, you do get 2 special forces with 2 Company 1st Commander Regiment.
Yeah, so we'd been working in support of 2 Company in Melbourne anyway, because I was posted into Melbourne at that stage as a reserve psychologist. So again, we kind of had a remit to cover all of the Victorian units that required support. And I made a point of sort of waving my hand and saying, look, this is an area I'm really keen at. I've got some skills in performance-based psychology. So, I think there's some opportunities there to push the envelope. And maybe it would give me a little bit of extra credibility with those guys as well, coming from a sports psychology background, perhaps rather than a clinical psych background. But look, there was no doubt that it was certainly my goal to try and get there, and I agitated for that. And that resulted in a posting and a position being created. We did have a psychologist at regimental headquarters in Sydney, but there was a clear recognition that person could not provide services geographically to Melbourne. It was just too hard. So there was a huge advantage in having a local reserve psychologist being able to post in, form that relationship, that working relationship with the OC and the command team, and then provide services in support of what the broader 1 Commando Regiment. So I posted in there. The first, as you can imagine, the first sort of 3 to 6 months is just building relationships, trying not to step on anyone's toes, trying not to make a fool of myself, and learning the ropes and getting involved with the training pipeline, which at that stage, of course, was also ramping up. There was a recognition that, 4 RAR, which was, rebadged commando, was still in its infancy and was still sort of finding its feet. There was a lot of round-out reinforcement and rotation work. A lot of the subject matter expertise in commandos had resided in one commando for eons up until that stage. And so that people were being pulled up into Sydney to provide course support or instruction, or then starting to round out rotations once commandos started to deploying into the Middle East as well. So there was quite a busy time. I mean, I think as a reservist in those days, I was probably getting close to 150 to 130, 140, 150 days a year, as well as managing a civvy job and young kids. And there was many times where I'd drive from the Mornington Peninsula, work in the city all day, ironically working for Defence Force Recruiting at that stage, then go out to Williamstown, parade for another 4 to 6 hours until 11 o'clock at night, sleep overnight on the floor, and then drive back to work in the city the next day, work that day, and then go home. So there was sort of a 48-hour period, which was almost entirely dedicated to defence.
Pretty dedicated for a part-time gig.
Well, it was that sort of unit. I mean, one commando, again, at that stage, most of the operators, most of the guys that were also reservists, many of them did well over 100 days, as well as managing jobs. It was the only way you could possibly get anywhere near the competency standards required, as a commando, which we're ratcheting up rapidly, obviously, because of the draw by 4 and the rapid skill acquisition required to get them up to speed as a deployable force. So, I was certainly not alone in often sleeping in the unit overnight. That was a regular occurrence by medical personnel, by operators, by many people. It was, I think that the irony of it being called a reserve unit, it operated very much like a full-time unit in many ways. So there was certainly an expectation. If you got posted there, then you needed to keep up. Otherwise, you were just left behind and seen as an ancillary logistical problem that wasn't there at the right times when it was needed to be there.
Well, it's all good having it as a reserve regiment in peacetime, but for context, 2005, we are going back to Afghanistan after having left. And obviously the SAS have been deployed, 4 RAR bracket commando, like you said, ratcheting up, and they became renamed the 2nd Commando Regiment in 2009. What I think is actually less spoken about in the conversation is the role of the 1st Commando Regiment in not just applying individuals who then might rotate into the full-time regiment, but actually deploying themselves. And that is with that regiment, you see your deployments to the Middle East. Can you give the listener, I guess, a bit of context on what one commando does as a regiment over the time you're there in the context of our operational interests, and then how your personal experiences tie into that?
Yeah, for sure. So look, I think, this was the stage really when SOCOM as an organisation was finding its feet. So it was an all hands on deck, culture across the entire formation in many ways. So at that stage, within SOCOM, we had possibly 2 full-time psychologists, one at 4 and one in the West, so one at SASR. We had 2 or 3 probably 3 or 4 reservists, so one at Perth, one at RHQ for 1 commando regiment, and one notionally at 4. And there was nobody at SO headquarters. So there was nobody flying the mental health or sort of special operations psychology component flag at SO headquarters. So that was, we were getting senior commanders reaching down from SO headquarters to find out how to do things from a mental health psychology perspective and try and implement policies. And let's not forget that, the training pipeline for a commando or an SASR trooper is a long time. You got a 2 to 3 year lead time at least, from, that's just even starting from selection. And then prior to that individual's probably dedicated 12 months to 18 months of training to get to the start line. So the logistical components of running those selection courses and running all of the training courses required to bring these guys up to speed, was well behind the 8 ball by the time we got to 2005. And so there was just a plethora of things happening. There was selection courses being run back to back, special forces entry tests being run around the country, special forces recruiting tools being run around the country by both east and west sides. And all of those things required medical support, because a lot of the entry standards are medical, and or psychological support. So they all require a special forces psych assessment. They all require a whole lot of paperwork. They all require a special forces paper board where, special forces training center, as it used to be called in those days, would sit around and have 200 applications on their desk every 6 months that they had to filter down, try and get rid of the appropriate people that, really shouldn't have been there ethically and morally. And that required a psychologist. So for a staff of maybe 4 full-time positions across the whole command, you could see why we're pretty busy. And certainly even as reservists, there was an expectation that you would go up and support CSTC, the selection course, which in those days was, yes, 4 weeks on the ground, but, 4 weeks of admin prior, 4 weeks of admin after. And so getting time off work, getting time away from your family, it was just manic. Manic, but exciting. Manic because there was lots of cool stuff and lots of opportunities to really make a difference.
And tell me about your deployments to the Middle East.
So, look, we realised pretty early, again, the 2 full-time psychology positions within SASR and then 4RER, they had full-time workloads back here in Australia. So they were looking after an entire regiment as a digital posting. So in the West, you've got upwards of 700 plus people and certainly very similar over on the East Coast. And then you've also got Special Forces Training Centre, 1 Commander Regiment, etc. So there were full-time jobs for those 2 individuals back here in Australia. And then we had, on top of that, the ramping up of deployments to the Middle East. So we had 300 odd personnel rotating in or out of theatre on both sides of the country, commencing about 2005, as you said. So that meant a psych support team going over every 3 or 4 months to sit there for up to 6 weeks to do all of that RIP work, to do all of the psych debriefing, to bring in the new rotation, to prepare them, make sure everyone has signed off and done their psych screens, and then come home, do your own decompression, do your own sort of refit, recharge, and potentially get ready to do it again. So I think I deployed probably 4 times over those first few years as a reservist again, which, once you come back, it's not like you sort of get 6 months off. You're back into supporting selection courses, et cetera, et cetera. So they were mostly what I would call, force insertion extraction teams. You go across, you're embedded into the SOTG rotation. You're there to pull out the team that's leaving and make sure they're managed back into care. And then you're also there to welcome that new team in. There's a handover component. So we would be required to collect and collate all of the data from the individual debriefs, de-identify it, and then write a handover brief from a mental health wellbeing and performance sort of workplace stress component to both the outgoing CO of the SOTG and to the incoming CO, so that the CO coming in would have an idea of some of the issues that they may face with their personnel during that rotation. So you would be responsible for doing that data collection and debriefing all the personnel, writing a report, sitting with the COs and briefing them on what you'd found. And that would also go back to SO headquarters. So pretty high level stuff, quite stressful. You're briefing pretty senior commanders who are obviously, for many of them, it was also, a really important component of their career. We didn't know how long the SOTG rotations were going to go for. So everyone was keen to perform well. And that included, the various COs of those rotations. And so as again, I guess a fairly junior captain still in the reserve, in a corps which is often not seen as critical to the functioning of a special forces operation, there was a fair amount of stress to get it right, because it was reflective across the rest of, certainly not just this SO sort of Special Operations Command, but also the broader army.
Well, you end up deploying to the Middle East more often than many infantrymen in the regular army. You go to Iraq in 2006 and Afghanistan in 05, 06, twice in 2008, 2009, and 2011. So you are away a lot, and the workload you describe is cerebral and intensive and emotional labor as well. And across that, you're with One Commando 05 to 07, and then you're the regimental psychologist for the Special Air Service Regiment for a year in 2008. Just across from 05 to 08, when you're working with commandos and then SASR, just that first few years of getting stuck into that back-to-back rotations and deployments, how do you see the atmosphere in the room change? Do you see a change, and what does that picture look like over those 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, look, I think what I certainly noticed, and I think it was a commonly agreed sort of thought pattern, was that there was an immense professionalisation of SOCOM. So, there was a lot of stuff that had only ever been done in training, or was just a concept, or was, fitted for but not with type in terms of equipment that was able to be, I guess, battle proven. So there was an immense development, even having a look at the gear that I was issued in 05 through to the gear you're issued in 2011. The amount of change within SOCOM was astounding in many ways. I mean, at the time, it's a bit like getting up and watching your hair grow in the mirror each day. You don't really notice that those things are changing, but in hindsight, you can see that, the dramatic changes that occurred in all sorts of components, parts of SOTG rotations, and then the filter down of that into training, selection, and just the general, I guess, professionalism within special operations. Not that it wasn't professional before, but it was just such a rapid period of change that it was an immensely exciting time. There was always opportunities to do and experience amazing things. And certainly, obviously, within SOCOM, that was even more prevalent. But there were opportunities that presented themselves that you either had to grab and run with, or you were left behind. And look, fortunately, I was in a good sort of stage of my life. I had a well-established business. I had kids by that stage, and I had a very supportive partner. But it was full on. And it probably wasn't until after, I think, probably 2008 at that stage, after a year of full-time work at the over in Perth and 2 deployments that year as well. The second one, I actually got extended in theatre. So I was over there in late November, and my sister was getting married in December. So I had been told that I would definitely be home for her wedding. And then they extended me into nearly Christmas. And so they flew me from basically from Tarancot all the way back to Australia on a Friday. I was at my sister's wedding on a Saturday. I was back on the A330 on the following Monday and back in theatre by the next Wednesday. And that was just the sort of stuff that they would do, because everything was run on the smell of an oily rag and was just in time management. And there wasn't like there was another psychologist they could just, pick and say, oh, yep, you've done force prep, you've done all the ticks in the boxes, you're qualified on M4, you know how to do all these things, so we can just plug you in and not worry about it. It was just, well, he's the only one. We promised him he'd get to his sister's wedding, so we'll just make it happen.
Well, you talk about something like the gear improving and that increase of professionalism in our Tier 1 forces. But then how does that then translate further into the human personnel management? Like you have joked earlier that psychologists not always regarded as the most essential role type, especially in a special forces unit. Did the appreciation and usefulness of your role change while you were there? Is that something more in hindsight, or how did you just find your practical application of your skills on the ground changing?
The Defence Force itself, and certainly Special Forces, have come a long way. I mean, I remember doing Return to Australia Psych screens in 2003 in Timor with fairly young infantry soldiers, predominantly male, of course, in those days. And I don't think we've still got too many females, unfortunately. But and look, their, I guess, feedback or reaction to a psych screen was fairly flippant. Very few of them took it seriously. Very few of them, you could tell, were certainly comfortable with the process. And as a result, you got pretty minimal input back in 2003. By about 2008, that had started to change. So people had got comfortable with the process. They knew that it was mandatory. Many had at least one or two before. And certainly the same was prevalent in SOCOM. You just had a higher level of professionalism. So, even if it was a fairly junior trooper or commando's first experience of a return to Australia psych screen, they were usually professional enough to take it seriously, or at least be really good at lying through their teeth. I'm not sure. And look, they just got more comfortable with it over time. Certainly at that sort of one-on-one sort of perspective or experience, people just got used to it. They just knew that you went out to get them. You were there to help. And whilst many of them didn't really, I think, probably even realize themselves that they, had stuff that they could have talked about, they were at least professional enough to sort of engage in the process quite willingly. At a command level, I guess it was probably more, I think, more personality based. So you had some commanders who really valued the input from a strategic HR perspective, how best to help manage their personnel. And they were often, I guess, the people who had personalities that were, of the view that, people were best managed through a personal relationship. And you could see that they were interested in what you had to say. And whilst they might not always agree with or follow your recommendations, they were certainly quite willing as commanders to hear your point of view and to take it into consideration. There were certainly other commanders, for whatever reason, who just thought it was, to be honest, a load of shit. And that might be because of, their own experiences or their stage of life or their own personal sorts of views about mental health and psychology. They were certainly always professional and always, still engaged in the process. But the outcomes were often quite different. And look, I guess the difficulty as a allied health logistics sort of background person is that, we were never there to make life more difficult for anyone. We were always there to try and assist in the maintenance and enhancement of their human capability. That was our primary objective. If we weren't there to enhance or manage their human capabilities, then why the hell were we there? But yeah, you often had a hard time convincing some commanders that was genuinely why you were there, that they had suspicions that you were there to, to send the soldiers back home or to make life more difficult for them by feeling sorry for soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. So you had to work quite hard to win them over. And there were some you just didn't win over, and that was okay.
We also, though, will see an increase of impact of these deployments on personnel from looking at a casualty perspective. By complete coincidence, we're talking on the 8th of July, which is now the 13th anniversary of Sean McCarthy's passing. And in 2007, I think we had 4 casualties, and then that pace picks up. And so you're starting to sort of see the beginning of that, I guess, and not looking for any specific names and stories here, but I suppose also you're having to process on, keep an eye on units that are suffering casualties in field and they're not getting to go home. They got to keep carrying on with their day-to-day tasks in the field, which we know are immense and intense in their nature. How does that change as well when you're dealing with that kind of on the ground, not just the rapidity of the deployments, but then also as the cost of them gets higher?
Yeah, look, it's quite an interesting piece, and this is where I guess, perhaps I was certainly finding that my views, both professional and personal, were deviating a little bit away from what the mainstream of Army psychology and mental health was trying to promote. We'd seen a transition, I guess, for all the perhaps obvious reasons, within particularly the Australian Army Psychology Corps over the preceding sort of 5 years to a far more clinical focus. So they were much more interested and engaged with and training psychologists around clinical assessment, counselling, etc. And that was probably as a result of what we'd started to see coming out of the legacy of, even Timor. There was certainly an uptick in trauma and people requiring counselling. But what psychologists had always done in the army is been this sort of strategic human resource capability. So yes, they delivered some counselling and clinical support, but they were also there as, I guess, the overarching, biofeedback tools, if you want to call it that, to commanders to help them manage their capability in the field. And that was probably no more prevalent than special forces. They knew they needed some clinical capability, but it probably wasn't really necessary for that to be in the field, because we'd done a whole lot of selection work to choose people that were resilient and robust. So even if they weren't coping with some of those things particularly well, they were able to compartmentalize it and keep going with their job. And look, Army's a bit of a brutal beast in some ways. The mission is paramount. That doesn't mean we're cavalier or disregard the human impact of trauma on individuals. But we don't stop the war, particularly in special forces. You can't stop the war because usually they're, well inside enemy lines and so far away from support where how are you gonna get them out? So what we were finding in SOCOM, I guess, is that, we would be, let's say we had a trips in contact experience, there was somebody injured. So that would be considered in, I guess, the clinical mindset of many psychologists as a critical incident. There's potential for trauma there. And we were getting pressure, and by we, I mean the psychologist in SOCOM, we were getting pressured by the rest of Army psychology, mental health, to kind of lean in and intervene and to kind of almost stop the war and say, no, those guys need to come back. They need to have what we call a critical incident mental health support process. They need to be screened. Because we know that early identification of trauma is good. What they perhaps weren't, I think, as good at reading is that that's not what SOCOM was about. SOCOM was about continuing the fight. And so we had to walk this middle line where, we, on one hand, obviously as a member of SOCOM and responsible to the command in SOCOM, my advice to those commanders was, unless there was really clear behavioural evidence that certain soldiers weren't dealing with that in the field, then you crack on. We'll deal with it. I mean, my job is to deal with any fallout of that after the fact when they come back inside the wire or at the end of their rotation. But we deal with it strategically. We don't always deal with it tactically. And the presumption of resilience, the presumption of the capacity to continue on should be the primary presumption, because we've selected and trained these individuals to be able to deal with that. And of course, there are always individuals, fairly rare, I think, that couldn't deal with it at the time. But the balancing of that operational imperative and the presumption of the ability to cope in a special forces soldier was, I think, made the rest of Army mental health uncomfortable. It was scared, that we'd be held liable for that sort of view. So what we were seeing probably more often than the trauma-based stuff was the impact of those cumulative deployments on individuals. So it was a fatigue, a chronic fatigue, and I don't mean that in the sense of the syndrome, but just if soldiers were away from partners, children, normalcy, life back home for 6 or 8 months of pretty much every year, not always entirely on deployment, but there's still promotion courses, there's still requalification courses that they need to do when they get back. You just start to see people's lives fragment, and so part of the role of a psychologist in many of those units is to sit on what used to be called the HR board, the Human Resources Board, which is now called a Welfare Board, and to basically on a weekly basis to monitor the personnel and identify any individuals that were starting to struggle, and to put in place sort of management plans for those things. So we were certainly starting to see an uptick in the number of personnel that were struggling at the HR board. Interestingly, that was always viewed as stuff that was going on back home. So it was only ever, the HR board only ever happened back in the regimental headquarters back in Australia. So the operations were seen as separate. And because we had this functional, sort of emphasis to cope, we didn't pick up on as much stuff overseas. But we certainly knew and were feeding back to commanders, look, by about 2007, 2008, if not earlier, guys were getting tired. And all of the warning signs for that were primarily happening back home: marital breakdowns, fights, getting into small disciplinary issues. For support staff, it was often a request to post out, that they were just so sick of the tempo and being smashed that they wanted to go back to normal army. And so they were the warning signs we were seeing, not so much the trauma and the losses. I mean, I would say that people parked a lot of that stuff. They were too busy on the operation and didn't have the capacity and didn't want to let their mates down. And so what we're seeing, and what is often known to be the case with trauma, is that it's usually stuffed in a box in the back of your memory. And once you get out of army, once you get out of the structure and the routine, that's when you sort of your spiritual being, if you want, or your mind says, "Oh, I've got time to unpack that now." And so we start to see the wheels fall off once they get out of army for the trauma-based stuff.
And the fact they can put that trauma in a box because they're selected for that capability, for that level of psychological resilience, that also validates the mandate you're given by SOCOM that your first priority while you are on deployment was to preserve the capability of the unit and prioritize that over individual care. Not that there wouldn't often be overlap with those things, but if it came to one between the two, the capability is what mattered when you were over there.
Look, absolutely. And look, it's an ethical and a moral line. And obviously for a psychologist, it's a professional line. There was never a circumstance that I can recall where as a mental health professional, I was asked or commanded to make a recommendation or change a recommendation that would increase the damage, psychological or otherwise, to a human being. Were we asked to make judgments about how long can this person stay in theatre? Can we or should we move this person into a different role in theatre? Absolutely. And I think they're all good strategic sort of human resource management requirements. So if somebody's struggling, maybe they've had a series of bad experiences and they've just lost their mojo outfield, rather than package them up and send them home, let's see if we can change their role, keep them inside the wire, give them a useful skill where they can contribute, see if they can get their mojo back, and then we push them back outside the wire again. That was the sort of stuff that happened more often than not, and I think that was just good human resource management. The clinicians might say, yeah, but there's the potential to re-traumatize that individual. But if we sent home every person who had the potential to be traumatized in a high-intensity counterinsurgency warfare, well, there'd be no one left.
You don't have an army then, no.
No, it's right. It's kind of bad for you from the outset. So we need to, we need to recognize that going to war is not good for you. Anyone who thinks it is kind of a bit nuts.
No, but the measure of that trauma, I suppose, is relative to the nature of the work and what you're going over there to do. You said before that the real warning signs were back home and things like marriage breakdowns, and you could see then that the wheels starting to come off, to use that cliche. And you were quoted in The Australian, I think last year, quote, "People had their values and morals effectively broken by chronic deployment to a basket case for country and seeing good friends do bad things and good friends die." Can you talk more to that and sort of how that rapid rate of deployments had that impact on individuals over time, and also how that was able to occur?
Yeah, look, I think it's there's a great model in aircraft accident investigations called the Swiss cheese model, which you may have heard about, and some of your listeners have probably heard about as well, which is just a whole lot of small errors lining up. And look, I think what happened in my experience and I guess from the knowledge that I gained personally was something along those lines. I mean, there's so many components of that it actually is quite hard to put your finger on one and say, well, that's the reason why we ended up with a, Inspector General ADF major investigation into bad stuff happening. But certainly I think, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and we can look back and we can start to see the genesis for some of these holes in the layers of the Swiss cheese starting to occur quite early. And fatigue was one of them. We don't have any data. We do now, but we didn't have any data about the impact of multiple deployments over, a fairly compressed period of time. The US was starting to get some data, in the mid 2000s. To mind you, their deployments are 12 months. Our guys in SOCOM were only doing 4 months. We brought in, or the Army tried to bring in, a policy of not allowing SOCOM soldiers to deploy within a 12-month window. So the maximum time you could spend overseas was 4 months. And that was for exactly that reason. It was for a good reason. We were trying to maintain the capability by giving it the opportunity to rest. But on the other side of that, you've got, politicians and political agendas, which I would suggest were somewhat reticent to use mainstream Army. Clearly, there was a fear about the capabilities and the potential losses if we used mainstream infantry to do some of those tasks. Politicians, I think, probably suspected or knew that they had a safer option in continuing to use SOTG rotations to do the heavy lifting. And let's not pretend for a minute that within SOTG there wasn't a desire to continue to do that. I mean, remembering that we had this massive acquisition of new technologies, new capabilities. Many of these units were now interacting with other tier 1 units around the globe. There was lots of opportunity for technology and training transfer. There was lots of relationships being formed, both with our allies and other forces that we had often very limited opportunities to train with or operate alongside. So there was a huge amount of good stuff coming into SOCOM at that time, which was drawing those rotations forward. Guys wanted to go back because it was an opportunity just to continue to grow that capability. And I think there's possibly even more so within SASR, which had lost a lot of focus with the rapid sort of capability coming online from Commando, from the Commando capability. So if Commandos were getting a lot of that quasi-infantry work because it's better suited to them anyway, what did SASR have left to do? The strategic sort of surveillance stuff was seen as kind of boring. We had ISR and lots of other techno aspects that were taking a lot of those capabilities offline anyway, so they didn't need a human asset as much. And so I think there was this really, this sort of impetus to keep pushing limitations, to continue to grow, to evolve that SAS capability into something new as soon as possible, which meant that the unit, I think, wanted to keep going back there. So I think it's important not to deny that and say that, they were forced to go. There was clearly a motivation to go. But it's a bit, perhaps, I don't know if it's a great metaphor, it's a bit like asking a greyhound not to run. They like running. So, there had to be a recognition, perhaps, at a mature, responsible level, that yes, we could let the greyhound run itself to death, or perhaps we needed to also be able to step in and say, how do we best maintain this capability? We're starting to get some feedback that suggests it's getting tired. It's starting to, get sort of fatigued, and things are getting a bit creaky, and there's individuals that are, perhaps exhibiting some behaviors we should be worried about. But that got caught up in this enthusiasm to keep doing the job, to keep saying yes. And that obviously filtered down to individual levels where, as we did start to lose some capability, particularly in logistical areas, people were just getting burnt out and not able to redeploy. We would start to, rob Peter to pay Paul. So that guy who meant to, had done a 4-month rotation, was meant to have 8 months off. We'd go cap in hand often and say, look, we really need this, capability in theatre. You're the only person that has it. We'll sign off, we'll get Chief of Army to sign a waiver. And, if you're prepared to go again, we'll send you back over. And so the whole thing started to accelerate, where people were continuously being brought forward, and more waivers were sought.
And if you're in that kind of environment and that kind of unit and that kind of brotherhood and that kind of personality, you're not going to say no to that.
You don't say no, absolutely not, because it's seen as letting your mates down. And in a special forces, small team environment, that's the worst thing you could do. It's the end of your career. You've just bailed on your mates. And look, let's not pretend that every single person who did that ended up broken. There are a lot of guys, and girls who did that sort of stuff and came out the other end okay. It's not everybody that was totally burnt out. It's just unfortunate, I guess, that the nature of many military organisations is if you are the individual who's struggling, who perhaps is having your life fall apart around you, you don't put your hand up, because the culture is accelerating away from you very rapidly, and so it's actually safer psychologically to just shut up and keep doing it and hope.
I quoted that Australian article because it's obviously something with the Brereton report and all the furor around alleged war crimes and the Ben Robert Smith defamation trial and all the stuff that's going on in the press. There is a understandable interest from the public for answers and for an explanation of sort of our international reputation is on the line here for a war many people don't understand. I understand where there's armchair critics and hindsight goggles to diagnose past causes of potential current issues, but then things like looking at psychology reports, it's not like you and your colleagues, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you and your colleagues at the time weren't writing reports about, well, we're having this burnout from too much deployment, or we're having this moral or psychological fatigue, or not waving a flag, hey, you're setting up ground for potential war crimes here. You're writing that because you're concerned about the individuals, and to a greater extent, therefore, if you have individuals burning out, you are having a reduction in capability for those regiments as well. But it's on that personal scale, and hindsight can pin, well, that explains the issue we're dealing with now.
Look, absolutely. And, let's not pretend for a minute that the psychological capability wasn't, sort of vulnerable to the same things. I mean, as I said earlier, there was only a small team of us that were often doing multiple rotations ourselves. The capability within the psych capability within SASR was not always great at talking it to the psych capability in commandos, and we certainly didn't always talk very effectively with the capability that started to become established in SO headquarters, and we almost never talked to the capability in broader army. So we filed those reports largely as individuals, largely as a report about one particular rotation, and we sent those reports off to Canberra, to SO headquarters, or to Penguin initially and then Bungendore ultimately, with a view like any other sort of captain level officer that somebody would be putting those pieces of the puzzle together and saying, well, hang on, there's a trend here. I can see that over the last 2 years, we've started to see an increase in, compassionate return to Australia's, or an increase in people, reporting to welfare boards, etc. But of course, nobody was doing that. Well, perhaps if they were, they certainly weren't doing it very well. But, I think that, again, there was this forward-looking organisation at SO headquarters that was always thinking about planning the next rotation, and the capacity to really stop, learn from the trends that were coming out of the data, and implement change was kind of not so much forgotten, but it just wasn't prioritized. It was too busy, too rapid. Everything was moving so quickly. It was always the next deployment, the next rotation. Let's focus on that. And these reports were often, I suspect, probably just filed with a great intention of somebody coming back in the future and doing that data analysis. But there just wasn't the capability to do that. We can now, which is, I guess, why we can look back, and even individuals like myself can look back over my series of deployments and go, oh yeah, well look, there is some trends there. I didn't really notice them at the time. I noticed the individual stuff at the time and put that in the report. But now looking back, I can go, of course, the rates of burnout, the rates of trauma, and things were increasing. We probably should have noticed that. And we did in other ways. We did in technological ways and skill ways. We just didn't do it so well in mental health ways. And look, all I can suggest, and I think it's a reasonable assumption, is that just like everything else in military, I mean, most of those people in SO headquarters and in command positions are on 2-year postings. Is 2 years long enough to be able to see the trend? Now, if it's laid out for you in a pretty graph, someone's done all that work and can show the preceding, 6 or 7 rotations that there's an increase in something, then yeah, of course you'd expect somebody to go, well, hang on, something bad's happening here. We better do something about it, and it's on my watch, so I better do it. But I don't think that ever happened. I think there was just so much data coming in from these sorts of deployments that a lot of it was just assumed that we'd get around to that in the future, and that everyone was too busy focusing on the next rotation and just in time managing that to have the capacity to sort of do the data analysis and see this stuff. That's not a get out of jail card. I don't think that means, that nobody's responsible. Clearly people were in positions where they should have been doing that. But I think it is contextualized by just how busy we were for that period of time. And human nature. The human nature is to focus on the next problem, and if you don't have time for anything else, then you're a human being. You go home exhausted like everybody else, even if you are working in Bungendore and trying to read, multiple reports.
I think it's also human nature, at least these days, to want a simple black and white answer that you can write in a tweet. And this isn't going to have that. So that's why people are looking for a straight definitive answer from you, and there isn't one.
No, and look, even if there was people that came up with those answers, again, the political and command imperative to keep moving forward was pretty clear. There was nobody suggesting that SOCOM wanted to stop doing those rotations, and I don't think there was any politician that was that keen to change the status quo. It was working. We lost people, but it was, relatively low risk to continue to use special forces. The public appeared to like it, that it was good. So why would anyone, even if you had those answers or that data, it was almost career suicide, I suspect, to be the person who waved that flag and went, oh, actually, hey, we better stop using special forces. We might burn them out. I don't think that was going to be popular.
Let's come back to your career, Mark. You have this escalation through special forces, and I suppose, as you described earlier, that professionalism increased. You get to see that across all levels. As we've covered, you were the company psychologist for One Commando. You were then the regimental psychologist for SASR. In 09 to 11, you're a staff officer at Special Operations Headquarters. So where you previously had SOCOM reaching down to your guys at the lower level for advice, you now are a psychologist up there. That capability and capacity has grown. Walk me then through, I guess, the rest of your career, what that 09 to 11 entails, what happens after that. Tell me the rest.
Posting out of SAS at the end of 2008, in retrospect and certainly at the time, it felt like it was the pinnacle of my career, particularly bearing in mind I started out as a wannabe sports psychologist. So my job or my goal was certainly to work with the best performers in the military, and working at the SAS regiment was certainly that. I mean, these guys were friggin' incredible. 12 months of working in that unit full time, 2 deployments, I was pretty tired. I mean, I came out of there pretty wound up, I think is the short answer. It was frenetic, and I needed a bit of a rest as well. So I came back to Melbourne. Ironically, I came back into a consulting job in the Civvy Street, which then saw me spend the next 3 years traveling through Southeast Asia working for mining companies. So I went back to deploying again. But I got on with my personal life, I suppose. I wanted to reestablish and rebuild my civvy career because I needed to pay the bills. And I got posted into SO headquarters ostensibly in a project officer job. So my job was to put out spot fires. We collated a lot of data by that stage. We knew some policies needed to be written. We needed to get better at selection. And so I supported the selection course over in Perth. Over each of those successive years, I wrote some policy, did some project work around psychosocial risk in workplaces, and contributed where I could, having now had all that experience. And look, I think like a lot of people, I was possibly a little bit under-enthused about being a staff officer, thinking that it would be quite unglamorous.
You're not the only person who's expressed that sentiment to me.
Absolutely. And I would have been quite happy staying a major. That's, probably even a captain. I think I'd been a captain, for 8 years by that stage. So I was well overdue promotion. But look, in hindsight, I do see the benefit in having, people who've been at the coalface in whatever profession. It doesn't have to be psychology, but, if you've done the hard work, if you've done all those sorts of deployments, then you do bring a sense of reality and knowledge about what works into a staff job, which is critical, because if you're the one writing the policy about what's going to happen in the future, you want somebody who's had that sort of experience. So they write it from a perspective of this will actually work in the real world, rather than I think the theory suggests this will work. So that caused some friction for me, no doubt. Certainly, back in a staff job, even albeit in Special Operations Headquarters, you still have to then interact with the rest of Army. And the rest of Army hadn't had that rapid development. So, there was some differences in perspective around how mental health needed to be implemented or changed from a policy perspective that I had to, butt heads with other people who were often more senior to me in terms of rank and probably experience as a psychologist, but hadn't had that set of experiences. So it was an interesting time. After that, so 2011, I got posted out of SOCOM. I actually requested a posting back into a reserve unit. I think I'd done my time as a staff officer. And I really wanted to try and get back into a subunit. I fought for the opportunity to be a subunit commander, which is a bit of a rarity as a psychologist again. By that stage, there were really only 3 health corps, which was, medical, nursing, and dental. And around about that time, psychology was kind of brought in from the cold as the 4th health corps, which meant we were eligible for subunit command of health units. So I sort of slipped under the radar as a reservist. Having had the SOCOM experience gave me a lot of credibility in terms of knowing what I was talking about. And I was very fortunate to get posted in as a subunit commander of a health company in Victoria, a reserve unit, and then spent the next sort of 3 years really trying to rebuild that capability.
And after 21 years and 7 months with the Army Reserve, starting as a soldier and finishing as a lieutenant colonel, you finally decide to hang up the uniform and fully embrace civilian life.
So, yeah, look, it was a bit of a bittersweet decision. And I probably, to be honest, reservists have the luxury of, you can kind of hang around in the wings without anyone typically noticing you there. Certainly as a senior officer, you get posted into these obscure places in Canberra on paper. And if you want to, you could kind of stick around and do nothing much, or as much as you're able to do for a long time. But I guess what I'd found and what I really enjoyed was the opportunity to do real stuff, to the cut and thrust of actually getting stuff done. And look, I'm just no shrinking violet, as I'm sure you know, and I've rubbed some people's noses the wrong way, both in my own profession and in other parts of Army. So to I guess become a bit of a wallflower and sit in Canberra on paper was never something that I desired. And knew, to be honest, that I'd probably be pretty crap at because I like getting stuff done. And so by that stage, I'd also started to become interested in veterans issues and working with people that were, the product of that 15 years. And I saw more opportunity to do that out in Civvy Street, or at least DVA Street, than inside defence. And so I started to get involved in some veterans projects and charities on the outside, and found that I could, contribute more effectively in my eyes, and probably have more value and more fun outside the military. Conversely, look, I did get involved in a project towards the end, which was sort of a high-level project to rewrite the mental health strategy around resilience in Army, and I made some contributions to that. And look, no disrespect to anyone else who was involved in that project, but I could see that it was becoming a political monstrosity, and I just, I thought felt like the right time.
Well, Mark, tell me both, what are you doing with yourself today? And looking back, how do you reflect on your time in the Army, what it did for you and what you did for it, and where you're at today?
Look, sure. And I think the only word I can use to describe serving alongside many of the people I've had the good fortune to work with and support as a psychologist, it's a privilege. You, as a psychologist, people are amazingly generous, I guess, in giving of them their own stories. And that's a pretty rare privilege. I think I tried to calculate, how many people I've sat with and asked them to kind of tell me the story of their lives. And there'd be thousands, thousands and thousands of soldiers have sometimes not so willingly, but, quite oftenly willingly told me some of their deepest and darkest, stories and times, as well as their greatest successes. And that's a very privileged position to be in, to earn the trust of people and allow them to tell you some of the stuff that they might not even tell their families or tell their mates. You can't really be given much more of a privilege than that. And so as my career progressed, to be able to try and shape things for them as a staff officer to try and make it better, was certainly something that I enjoyed and relished, and hope that, along the way, I've certainly made some differences for individual military personnel along the way. For me personally, look, it's given me again that unique experience as a mental health professional to see people both at the pinnacle of their performance and to learn a bit about what it takes for a human being to perform at that level of extreme performance, which is, again, pretty unique. And conversely, the other end of the extremes where people are absolutely, traumatized, devastated, destroyed by their vocation or the requirements that come with it. And to try and, work out how to assist those people at that point in time. So, I think as a psychologist, compared to what I would, very carefully term my civilian colleagues, we're incredibly fortunate to be able to see some amazing extremes of human experience. Now, that's a blessing and a curse, I think, for me moving forward. It's a blessing in that, you really can see what humans are capable of, which is we're capable of pretty amazing stuff, not just in a military context, but just as human beings. The generosity and the ability to be kind in extremes of warfare is stuff that we've long learned from as a species. There's books that are written about the Jewish Holocaust, etc., that talk about how people can maintain a sense of humanity even in the worst of situations, and to experience that firsthand is pretty cool. It also does tend to taint you a little bit. So, as a psychologist who, if I wanted to, could quite easily go and get a job counselling, people in the middle income, middle age group, stream. There's no shortage of work in general counselling. My tolerance for some of the worried well issues that people deal with in our very comfortable, safe, secure Australian environment is sometimes pretty lacking, to be honest. So I can be quite intolerant of that, because once you've seen people do amazing things in extreme environment, and look, most Special Forces soldiers aren't uniquely special people. They're just normal people that do amazing things. And so when you have, no disrespect, but the worried well, 35 to 45-year-old married, mortgage stressed with 2 kids at private school, thinking that their life is terrible, and expecting you to fix it in sort of 6 sessions of counselling with a magic wand. Yeah, I'm not great at that anymore. So I've kind of been a bit tainted by that military experience. But what I can do, and what I'm now focusing on, is certainly working with veterans. So that's the audience or the group of people that I have expertise in. And I guess the precursor to veterans, I guess, are young men primarily. I don't mean that with any disrespect, but when young men go through transitions like the rite of passage into adulthood, boys become young men. There's a lot of similar issues that go on. There's some sort of cut and thrust stuff there that's, it can go really well and it can go really badly. And often the decision points along that road are pretty slippery. So I find myself drawn to that sort of cohort of people. And how do we set people up on these trajectories to live amazing lives right from the outset? And it starts much younger than joining the military. It starts, back in parenthood and school, etc. So trying to take that knowledge from that elite end and filter it all the way back into what are we doing good in our communities and what aren't we doing so well to set people up for success, in life. It's not about breeding amazing people. It's just taking those lessons that are hard won by veterans in places like war zones and saying maybe we need to relearn some of this stuff back for our communities as well.
Well, Mark, thank you for your service and sharing not just your journey, but I guess your insights into what is obviously a very topical issue, a very complicated issue in this community, a bit of a divisive issue as well. So I'm very grateful for you to come on the show and just sort of share your day-to-day perspective on what that was like and what that meant, and hope that can help inform the conversation we'll be having for years to come, I think, in constructive ways. So thank you very much for your candor and your time today.
Absolute pleasure.
Well, I've tried to forget how I've tried. The day my best mate put his life on the line.
In this podcast, Mark mentioned Dr. Dan Pronk. You can listen to Dan's original 2-part interview in Season 2. Number 31, Dr. Dan Pronk Vol I.
Certainly I'd been part of medical teams that had lost people in the past, but it was always in a hospital environment, and it still hits home to a degree, but it was just a whole different level when it's someone you know, someone who you've had breakfast with, the day before, and also when you're the one everyone's looking to as the person who's going to save this situation, and you simply can't.
And Volume 2.
I knew that at some point I was going to need to deal with all the events that had happened leading up to there. I knew that I would go from that fast-paced life to a much slower-paced life.
To find out what Dan is up to today, including his career as a writer, check out this year's episode, SAS Resilience, with Dr. Dan Pronk, Ben Pronk, and Tim Curtis.
These kind of things needed to be programmed into muscle memory, because we know that when you are under significant stress, and we were training these medics to go into combat environments.
This was towards the end of our selection course in a phase called Lucky Dip. When I looked around the gloom as the sun was setting on that particular day, there was a range of people inside that truck that were grossly and profoundly disappointed with the fact that their mind and body layer weren't connected.
In this conversation with Mark, I referenced the death of Sean Mccarthy. For more about Sean's passing, and for an interview with an SAS veteran who is now a psychologist, go back to Season 4 and listen to number 68, Harry Moffitt, Volume 2.
The leader is there to hold the light in the dark, to show the way forward.
And for another podcast touching on some of the topics in this episode, listen to the Season 5 interview, number 28, Mark Wales, Volume 2.
A war like that will turn good men bad and bad men evil.
Follow us at Life on the Line Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, at LOTL Pod on Twitter, and at Thistle Productions on LinkedIn. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions, artwork by Big Cat Design, theme music by Dan Van Werkhoven, closing music, The Hell Beyond, by The Externals. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget.
A man sure walks slow, might his step be your last. It can steal the mind quickly, and it can harden your heart. And you yearn for your family, and you long for your wife, and all that you're missing from a wonderful life. But out here I'm a soldier and a long way from home, and I gave up those comforts a long time ago. Out here in the dirt and the heat and the dry, there's no time for nostalgia, less abundance of mine. Just then I looked round and I caught Rowdy's eyes, and it snapped me back quicker than he raised up his sides. He squeezed off some rounds from behind a mud wall as I dived to me guts and I started to crawl. Well, I've tried to forget how I tried, but I'll never forget how the fear stole my mind. The cornfields erupted. Shit scared with self-doubt. My throat was bone dry and me heart filled me mouth. As the shots cracked around us, I remember the high, but it wasn't excitement, I was just terrified. The steel tore through clothing, mud walls, trees and flesh, as I emptied my mag towards nothing at best. And as I crawled forward, forward and I looked through my sights. I turned and saw Rowdy give a wink and a smile. He shouted with me as he sprung to his feet with his gun up and firing out into the green and the dirt all around him like rain on a pond as he made his way into the hell just beyond. Well, I've tried to forget how I've tried, but it's hard to forget such a beautiful sight. We got up and followed through machine guns and fire. I remember the dust, how the grip cut in the eyes. We battled and fought through the streets, maze and mud. And when I reached Rowdy, he was covered in blood. I crawled up beside him and I laid by his side. Not sure it was sweat or tears stinging his eyes. He grabbed for my hand and he winced through a smile as the din all around him fell silent and quiet. Well, I've tried to forget how I've tried, but I'll never forget the day Rowdy died. The bird dusted off, me best mate in a bag, as I licked at a rollie and we passed round a drag. We picked up and moved. We were dog-tired and beat. We were the dreaming awake and the walking asleep. As I sat with a beer, looking over the dash, and I drank and I pondered the shit day we'd had. But nothing like Rowdy, so I raised up my glass and I whispered to old mate it was over too fast. Well, I've tried